With nearly 5,000 specialists dedicated to supporting dealer financial services, Ally has the expertise to help you with your retail finance, F&I, and remarketing needs. We're all better off with an Ally. Contact your local Ally account executive to get started today. Ally, do it right.
Hey, it's Daily Drive executive producer Jake Neer here in Detroit. On today's bonus episode, we'll hear the second and final part of our own Molly Boygan's interview with U.S. Congresswoman Haley Stevens. We ran the first part of this conversation with the Michigan Democrat on Monday's episode of Daily Drive. If you haven't heard that yet, go back and check it out. In this part of the interview, Molly talks with Congresswoman Stevens about President Biden's push for EV adoption, as well as how to protect the U.S. from Chinese threats while also maintaining a strong and adaptable supply chain.
You've said that the Trump administration's tariff policy doesn't really acknowledge the complexity of this interwoven supply chain. And I feel that the government has a very unique challenge in trying to navigate that reality while also, as you say, preventing the national security threats associated with supply chain reliance on foreign adversaries. And in particular, I want to ask you about this in regards to the Department of Commerce's rule prohibiting hardware and software from China or Russia, because people in the industry have told me that also, despite its good national security intention, does not acknowledge the reality of navigating those supply chain challenges. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, look, it's a national security issue for sure. And last term in Congress and this term, I've been serving on the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. And I will tell you firsthand, sitting down with chip designers, particularly ARM, and their very, very rich history in this industry, that they shared that we cannot allow open source microchips and software coming in from China, and certainly not from Russia. And so the Department of Commerce has been utilized in the past on this, seeing those steps being taken and continue to be taken. That's a good example of the way in which we can use our federal government. I don't think you need to fire all the long-term civil servants to achieve that goal, but this is, again, part of the reason why I introduced the No Chinese Cars Act, to continue to secure our American industry and our American supply chain. Because again, in China, communist China, it's all vertical and it's all state owned. And we do know that we have automakers who aren't necessarily the original equipment manufacturers, who are a part of the supply chain, who are still doing business, based over in China. And, they'll tell you a different story. We, as policymakers, also need to understand, though, that we need a level playing field. And so my entire career has been based on protecting Michigan manufacturing and Michigan workers, and the steps that we can take in that direction, the co-investment, the healthy working alongside of our allies, and frankly, putting up some guardrails around China are all steps in that direction.
Let's turn for a moment to electric vehicle policy. To what extent do you think that the Biden administration was overzealous in incentivizing the electric vehicle transition?
Well, look, I'd actually turn that question back around to where I sit as a policymaker, which is automakers need to sell cars and Michiganders need to have freedom of choice in terms of what kind of car they need to drive. And frankly, this narrative about policymakers driving the entire conversation misses that General Motors over and over and over again said that they were going to net zero emissions by 2030. And certainly with things that I have worked on in the past alongside our auto industry, I, as a policymaker, only want to continue to set an environment where the free market thrives for the American consumer. And we want to see affordability. We want to see more money in people's pocketbooks. And we want to have honest conversations about what is actually going on in our American auto industry. 15 years ago, there were some early investments that were being made in new technologies. The market wasn't ready to adopt them. They went over to China. And then everyone, 12, 13 years later, has a cow when we're, left holding the bag and don't have those mature types of technologies here in the United States. And yes, some of that is in the battery space. Obviously, not all of that went to China. Some of it was also coming from Korea as well. But I think one of the things that we can all agree on is that Michiganders, Americans need to have freedom of choice in terms of the infrastructure in the broader ecosystem of driving on safe roadways and having the ability to get where you're going in a reliable way based on the accessibility of roadways and other systems. That's going to rely on us as policymakers. But I think that the big three needs to be pretty honest about what they were thinking they were going to be 3 years ago versus where they are now. And look, they'll tell you that they're selling a diversity of cars. And I personally just believe it's an all of the above approach. Look, if I wanted to be in the business of selling cars, I'd be working at a dealership. And there's a lot of great dealerships here in Michigan. Listen to the car salespeople. Listen to where the consumers are. Connect the dots. And that's the way that we'll continue to go forward here.
Coming up, we'll hear the final part of Molly Boygan's interview with Congresswoman Haley Stevens. That's next on this bonus episode of Daily Drive.
For over 100 years, Ally has helped dealers like you serve your customers by providing the best-in-class products and services you need, and by remaining true to the automotive passion we share. Your dedicated Ally account executive will work hand in hand with you to help you gain efficiencies, increase your product offerings, and work to improve per-vehicle revenue. Because we care about your business as much as you do. We're all better off with an Ally. Contact your local Ally account executive to get started today. Ally, do it right.
You mentioned that an all the above approach is, the way that you would go. And, that is, it does appear that a lot of the automakers are either delaying or pausing EV projects. They're, renewing a look at combustion engine vehicle technology. And, the prediction that I've heard is that the consumer is still really interested in what consumers may call like a gas guzzler. And that reminded me of your work on the presidential task force on the auto industry, because as you know, that auto industry crisis was in part prompted by a product mix that was too skewed toward SUVs and pickups. And then, fuel prices spiked and we all know what happened after that. So how do you view the sort of competing pressures that the industry faces on the one hand to resume work on combustion engine vehicle technology, and on the other hand, an awareness that, gas prices are low right now. There's also a global market for EVs that's accelerating. Yeah. How are you viewing those challenges?
No, that's an incredibly thoughtful question and frankly, approach, and a totally right question for a policymaker. And it speaks to why we have to have elected officials and why I'm proud to be an elected official at the federal level who is focused on industrial policy, because these market shifts happen and they happen quickly. I would say that there were a multitude of factors that contributed to the crisis of 2009. First and foremost, it started in 2008 and it came from the financial markets. We also had legacy healthcare costs that private industry was totally saddled with, given the lack of available healthcare policy in this country. This was pre-ACA. And I kept asking that question in the early days of the auto industry. Like, I think this is because we haven't done an Affordable Care Act. And lo and behold, about a decade later, some reports came out that were really talking about some of the things that shocked the balance sheets of these companies. Capital was very, very constrained in 2008, 2009. And that is ultimately what ended up happening to General Motors and Chrysler, but skipping over Ford because they secured some of the capital investments that they needed in 2007 before the tide rolled out. And so one of the things and one of the big lessons that we can learn, not only from that, but from the time period we're in right now, is that there are quick shifts. And that works if you're in the ones and zeros business. If you're making smartphone apps or things more in the high tech, low capital spend space. But for very capital intensive industries that are requiring and relying on major expensive pieces of equipment and product lines. In fact, I was just with Buell Motors, which is an incredible motorbike company who I remember from my time on the auto rescue, believe it or not, because of course we did the auto rescue and then started talking all about manufacturing policy. And Buell was a subset of Harley, and Harley was feeling the squeeze. And so Buell spun off, and now they're just getting going, but they're operating so lean that they're doing everything custom and by hand, which is beautiful. And these motorbikes are incredible. And it was very, very inspiring to spend time with them. And there's some work that I still want to do with them, certainly. But after sitting down with them, and they're actually represented by my colleague, Congresswoman Hillary Scholten, who's also done some great things on their behalf around some trade policies and, some lending issues that they're having with that, at the federal level. But what I'll say on all of this front is that if we are not in rigorous dialogue with manufacturers, we're not doing it right. I am just one lawmaker here in the United States of America on behalf of Michigan. And yet I have dedicated my scope of work representing some of the largest concentration of supplier jobs in the country to regularly spending time with these businesses, small, mid-size, medium, and large, to really develop an understanding of what they need from Congress and to help where I can. And so that is, in many respects, a way in which our entire federal government should be operating. And we don't want to be in the finger pointing business. And certainly I wasn't trying to place blame on decisions, but I just remember when I was involved in the lawmaking process, we do our best lawmaking when we bring all the stakeholder groups together. And that's what's going to be important for our auto industry going forward, with so many changing dynamics, and the fact that we need to win the race against the Chinese Communist Party. We need to make here in America, and make from a place called Michigan.
Congresswoman Haley Stevens, thanks so much for joining us on Daily Drive.
Hey, thanks.
U.S. Representative Haley Stevens spoke with our own Molly Boygan. As we noted on Monday's show, Congresswoman Stevens is in a competitive primary for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. In the coming weeks, we'll hear from some of the other candidates in that critical Senate race about their auto policy perspectives. Stay tuned for those conversations. That's all for this bonus episode of Daily Drive. We'll be back on Monday with a brand new full episode of the show.